Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about how families can make or break your healing. One preface to begin all of this: I'm not saying anything about whether families will make you better or not. Today, we're going to be talking about how family dynamics, interactions, and beliefs can shape the way that you grow, especially in the context of therapy. So let's talk about how families interact in therapy. Sometimes family members are directly involved in the therapeutic process, particularly around teenagers and young adults. I will encourage family members to be involved. I don't typically work with kids that are under teenage years, so I don't have a ton of experience there, but when I have in the past worked with young kids, obviously parents are involved. However, for the people that I work with, teenagers up, it can be incredibly useful and sometimes even vital into helping the client that I'm working with move towards healing. So sometimes family members are participants in therapy. Usually it's parents. Sometimes we consider their impact outside of the therapy office. When it comes to other family members, sometimes partners and family members can be in session. It doesn't just have to be parents. Sometimes siblings or children can be involved. Typically, when it involves kids, it isn't their job to do anything. It's more about the parent being able to share or change a dynamic actively in session. But no matter the case, everybody has family members outside of the 50 minutes that they spend in my office. And those family members can have a widely variable impact on someone's point of view in their healing. A lot of that influence can come from the past, though, from implications or events that have happened. Let's say, for instance, someone comes inside my office and they feel great and there's a direction towards next steps, only to go home and to get a reminder of why they're still struggling with the things that they are. So sometimes it's the past. And sometimes when people leave session, and I've worked in facilities as well, they can come in and feel great, but then they get back into the environment that they left, and all of a sudden old behaviors pop up. And no matter how much family wants to see them change and develop, stuff like that can still happen. So outside of the office, it's important to remember something, no matter your therapist or where you go to. If you're going to therapy once a week, you only see them for an hour. You have all of those other hours of the week, all of those other interactions. You only spend around an hour with a therapist. Now, can that hour be important? Sure. Absolutely. I mean, that's pretty much the hope of anybody who goes to therapy, but you live the rest of your life outside of that office. And in that week, you are influenced by everyone around you: coworkers, friends, significant others, children, and topic of today's episode, family. You may or may not tell family members that you're in therapy. For some people, therapy is just a factor of life. Well, everybody goes to therapy, so what's one more? Or in some cases, therapy is taboo, where it can be difficult to even acknowledge that someone in the family needs therapy. So sometimes family members' impacts can come from not wanting to know if someone's in therapy. So you may or may not tell the people around you that you're spending time with a therapist. I don't think anybody needs education on the type of dynamics that people get apprehensive about, right? If you go to therapy, something's wrong with you. If you go to therapy, that means you've given up, and all of these other lies that we tell ourselves. So people have different beliefs about therapy and how much they share. They develop these beliefs from typically the past, and a lot of times the present. I said before that some families view therapy in a positive light. Do I appreciate that? Well, yeah, I'm a therapist, so of course I appreciate that. Some people, though, find therapy to be that kind of weakness, and that's where family can have a great impact. You see, one of the important things about coming to therapy is to notice the reasons that you're there and the motivations you have to do work or to not work. Some people come to therapy because they feel like they're a burden. And typically that feeling of being a burden didn't start when they walked in my office. They have this feeling of burden on their family members, and to admit they need therapy could, in their own mind, be an acknowledgement that someone messed up, and they can't really admit it for their sake or for someone else's. So that can affect the way that they see therapy and how family can impact them. These beliefs about therapy can also be influenced by the present. Maybe someone did go to therapy and it was awful, which is an unfortunate thing, but it's sad to say I've heard a lot of those stories. I'm by no means a perfect therapist, but I have had plenty of clients over the years that say, wow, this is actually helpful. My last therapist did X, Y, or Z. So maybe there's some bad experiences. I will say, sometimes there's even coddling in therapy. I try to not do that, but it's easily a tendency. And so for a lot of family members, they can see therapy as a form of escape. You don't have to deal with this. You just go talk to your therapist about it. And some people can view it as a way to run away. One of the big impacts, these things that I'm talking about outside of the office, family stress and their interactions can greatly influence how someone functions and what they're able to talk about in therapy. Now, I'm going to sit on this for a second so you can think through. Let's imagine I have a client with me, and let's say that she has variable levels of success in therapy, where some weeks she feels she has a lot to work on, and in some weeks it feels like there's not much to do. If we weren't open in therapy and exploring how her family interacted with her, we might miss that her feelings of success or failure could be predicated on how well the family is doing. Because for a lot of people, they feel the burden of trying to make their family better. So when their family's not good, they're not good. And they come to therapy saying that there's so much going on, when in reality, the same is going on. It's just louder now. So this outside stress and influence can greatly affect not just what people think about therapy, but how they even gain benefit from it. These stressors or interactions might actually be one of the big reasons that someone comes to therapy. You know, I can't tell you how many times we start an intake and someone says, well, I'm this way because my parents, or we get into a little bit of family history, and it becomes very apparent that they believe that they haven't done a ton of wrong, but their parents have absolutely ruined it. Or even sometimes it's the opposite. You know, they're the terrible kid, but their parents are perfect. And I would argue that's also a family issue. Now, this type of interaction is important to explore in therapy because chances are when someone walks in my office, everything isn't perfect out there. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So it's usually a pretty safe guess to say, well, this is how family has been for the past 10, 15, 20 years. You're coming in my office and nothing has changed. It might be what you expect when you leave. So let me give you some very real, practical examples of how this is played out. I spent some time working in facilities, some for rehab and some for deeper mental health issues. And one of the things that I noticed is when people came into these facilities, whether it was rehab or treatment for schizophrenia, bipolar, or something else, is they could come in and feel very stable. They could get what they needed, their emotions were lower. But it wasn't until they left that all of a sudden the problem started up again. So where's the issue here? Is it for the alcoholic, or is it because of their meddling wife that causes them to drink? I hope you caught the little bit of tone there. I know you can't see my face, but it was wildly sarcastic. In these situations, as a therapist, I'm more concerned about what's going on in the family dynamic. Because if I took that same guy and I gave him no family responsibilities, he could probably remain sober. Great. What does that solve? Absolutely nothing, because there are other people involved in the world. So in some cases, they go home to the stress, and families are used to chaos, and so they enact it, force it, or expect it, and what do you know? We've relapsed. On the other hand, and I've seen this a ton in rehabs and treatment facilities as well, sometimes people go into treatment. They go and they feel better, only to go home to a family who babies them, coddles them, or doesn't treat them like a full-grown adult. And so what ends up happening is, from a family's lack of engagement, the person, the alcoholic, the drug addict, they come to think, wow, I don't have responsibilities. I don't have to care for people. Or maybe they just think I'm such a piece of crap that, I'm really not worth anything. They feel a level of distance. And this is what I mean about family dynamics. I'm going to give you a story that may be a little bit of psychological lore, but it was something I was taught in, I believe, undergrad and grad school. You can look this up if you'd like. It's a story from the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center, I think is what it's called. And basically what this facility was, it was a home for teenagers that were perpetual ne'er-do-wells. Okay? These kids ran away, they vandalized, they did all these sorts of things. And this treatment facility decided, all right, we need to do something for these kids to really help them. So what they did was they made it an inpatient facility, not necessarily medical, but they kept the kids there the entire time. The crazy thing was, in about a month, they took all of these kids who were combative, non-compliant, and hateful, and through things like a token economy, they were able to get these kids to listen, to engage well, to do chores, to do all of this. So the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center said, my goodness, we have cured these children. Things are great. They sent them home. And what do you think happened? Did they go back and continue to be great? No. In fact, most of them ended up exactly in the same place they were before. Now, whose fault would it have been? The kids or the parents? Well, if they're old enough to make their own decisions, the kids are at some level of fault, but the parents, they were so used to the dynamic of chaos and the kid being a negative influence and always trying to get away with something that they enacted it. They encouraged it, or they were so suspicious of the kid that they couldn't even imagine them being good, and so the kids relapsed into old behavior. And this is one of the big things when it comes to working with people who are hurting, who need treatment, is families can absolutely help restore, but they can also encourage relapse without realizing it. You see that story of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center. It's an incredibly important one because it can help us understand in therapy why kids sometimes do well and sometimes they don't. It's not always an indictment on the parents, but you have to ask the question, who raised them? How did this happen? When you get to people being adults and you start to think of their own parents, it's what scripts did you learn and what things are being repeated now? Are your parents, your family members wanting to break a cycle? Or are they just wanting to gain the veneer of breaking a cycle? Sometimes family members can realize that they've played a role in dysfunction. Sometimes family members can realize that the client themselves wasn't the problem. They were just the one who helped balance the problem. Look, I've given a whole bunch of different directions in all of this, and that's because I don't like giving direct advice without meeting someone. I like to offer these variable opinions so no one walks away from the podcast and says, aha, see, Travis said that you suck as a parent. I really hope nobody walks away with that. But I do want to underscore just how great of an impact I've seen in myself. I'll tell you one last story that could give you an idea of how family can make or break someone's healing. I worked in a intensive outpatient unit. And what that is after someone's in residential treatment, They step down and they go to these meetings at the facility, usually 3 times a week. And there's a story that I was told of someone who left treatment and was doing well. He stayed sober. He wanted to stay sober. But unfortunately, one day when he was coming to IOP and he was in the parking lot, his wife pulled up next to him. She didn't come to congratulate him or tell him he did a great job. Instead, she handed him a fifth of vodka. If you don't know what that is, it's a lot. He also drove there. She gave it to him and then drove away. Now, for someone who doesn't understand family or couples dynamics, that sounds insane. And there's certainly a level of insanity to all of it, but you have to understand, if families are so used to chaos, if they're so used to dysfunction that they don't know what to do without it, it is often safer to enact chaos than to wait for it to show up on its own. The enemy you know is not nearly as dangerous as the one that you don't. So let's talk about how families can help or stress. Outside of your own work and therapy, outside of your own work and growth of yourself, family members, particularly spouses, impact you the most. We even see this in literature where people who are in recovery or trying to change their mental health symptoms, when we look at what has impacted them the most, a lot of times people assume medication has been the greatest help or the greatest factor in change, and really isn't. Instead, it's what the person wants to do themselves, how they take control of their medication or needs, followed closely behind by their spouse and family influence. This even extends into taking significant medications, even for something like schizophrenia. You want to know how you help schizophrenia? Medication. Do you know how you get people to take the medication? They have to buy into it, and so does their family. I don't care if medication's the only cure. It doesn't matter. It's what the patient or client themselves and their family is willing to buy into. And so for that reason, I'm more focused on the person than I am about the pill. More focused on relational and family dynamics than I am about a medication regimen. I will tell you, family members can be direct agents of change. Sometimes I have a client who's stuck. Sometimes they're stuck because they don't want to move. Sometimes they're stuck because they can't move. And one of the best things you can do for them is to bring a family member and say, I know you don't feel like you can do anything, but I'm going to let you know you have no other option. And out of love and care and concern for autonomy, they tell them, if you don't change, we will, and you will not like that change. Family members can also keep boundaries and expectations. You know, we're not always the best versions of ourselves. Sometimes we need people in our lives to help keep us stable. You know, I'd actually had a discussion about this a while ago where someone said, you know, I don't always want to hear correction. I just want to be myself and figure it out on my own, which on the surface I could sort of understand, but I'm not always the best version of myself. I need my wife sometimes to step in and say, what are you doing? That's a terrible idea. Of course, I groan and grumble a little bit, but most of the time she's right. I need my wife to help keep boundaries and expectations for myself. We need family members to help guide us, not in a controlling sense, but in a loving sense. Family members can also be one of the greatest barriers. Sometimes if you were to change, then the whole family system were to change, because if you admit that something's wrong, everybody else has to acknowledge it as well. And for that reason, sometimes people wonder how much they should be connected to family. Let me be clear, I'm not advocating for alienation if family members are upset about your change. That's not it at all. But if family is unwilling to talk, if they can't seem to engage well enough to make anything meaningful happen, sometimes distance is needed. If you are the holder of the sickness in the family, which can be an episode for another day, but if you're the one who holds all the stress, if you got better, then everything else falls apart. So whose responsibility is it to keep it together? Last thing to kind of wrap us up here. I always want family members involved to some degree. That doesn't mean that I always want them in the therapy office, but I encourage clients to talk to their spouses, to talk to their loved ones, to talk to family members about the things that they're thinking. Sometimes they can get helpful feedback. Sometimes they can ask family members about a history that they didn't quite realize, or they can gain a different perspective. For that reason, family members are present in the office, even if they're not physically here. They can be some of the greatest factors of change. Even if it's just on the sideline, family can be a way to give you overall support. They might not get therapy, but they can get that you're doing better. And for the family members that are willing to hear feedback and discussion, even if they think therapy is a little woo-woo or whatever you want to call it, if they see you doing better and they like that and they want to support that, they're usually on board. If you're wanting your family to be involved, you cannot just say, trust me. You have to empower them. You don't have to tell them everything that you're talking about, but you do have to give them the opportunity to be supportive. And sometimes it's a little bit of effort. Sometimes it's a little bit of grace. But if you're doing everything you can, it might be time to empower family members or loved ones around you so that you're not just doing it on your own and someone can give you guardrails and support and feedback. For anyone listening, I hope that your family system is healthy enough to have this kind of feedback. Some family systems aren't, and clients will make their own little families. That's complicated and it can get incredibly messy, but we need a family of sorts. So I would encourage anyone listening to engage with their family that they have right now as much as possible. If that isn't something that's feasible, find a family or community around you that you can connect to, because families can absolutely make or break our healing. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something useful out of the podcast today. If you found it to be beneficial enough, I hope you follow the podcast, get the weekly downloads, share it with friends and family members and those that might be interested. If you feel the need, you can leave something in the tip jar to help pay for the production of this podcast. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.